Ms. Murray, until 2010, you were a Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East in the National Intelligence Council. Could you please briefly explain the role of this organization?
Yes, the role of the National Intelligence Council is to bring together the 16 different intelligence agencies basically around a table and come to a consensus about the political, military, and economic aspects of a given country, a given issue, such as, well, let's give Iraqi weapons of mass destruction as one example, the internal situation in Iran, any country or issue that's of primary importance to U.S. policy. And the National Intelligence Council issues the National Intelligence Estimate, which is an authoritative document from these 16 different intelligence agencies that basically give the consensus of the intelligence community on these issues to the policymakers, to the government, to help them to make rational decisions about foreign policy.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Murray. Mr. McGovern, you support whistleblowers. What significance do whistleblowers have in an international climate that is growing increasingly dangerous?
So the role of the whistleblower is really important because it basically inspires people inside governments all over the world to speak truth to power, to speak out. Whistleblowers such as Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden serve the function of informing the world of what governments, in this case the U.S. government, is doing. Because the mass media in the United States are tightly controlled, there was no other way for the American people to know, for example, the role of the U.S. military in Iraq in killing innocent civilians. In the particular case of Chelsea Manning, the video Collateral Murder also showed the murder of 2 Reuters journalists. This
was in Iraq, wasn't it?
This was in Iraq. This shocked the world, and also I have to mention the role of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, because they also released all sorts of important documents, many of them, though not really, there seemed to be no justification for them to be secret or top secret. These were documents that should have been available to the public, but again it shows that classifying information in the government is sometimes done in a manner that does not take into account the right of the American people to know what their taxes are paying for. So the whistleblowers, again, have an extremely important role.
Mr. McGovern, what role does whistleblowers play?
Well, it's hard to add to what Elizabeth just said. To have a democracy, you need to know what decisions your government is making. If there is no transparency, if all these decisions are made in secret, then we get unnecessary wars, we get wars of aggression, we get the destruction of countries like Iraq, Syria, and we get all kinds of things that the American people and people at large in the world should know about before, so that they could prevent them.
We spoke with one another 1 year ago. At the time, you were author of an open letter to Chancellor Angela Merkel, warning her against basing Ukraine policy on false allegations produced by intelligence services. Did you receive an answer?
I think this was 2 years ago when we talked to, when we wrote a letter to Angela Merkel having to do with the NATO summit. And we warned her not to believe what General Breedlove says, because he had been fabricating information. And at the time, it looked like the U.S. would support Ukraine even militarily. To her great credit, she stood beside President Obama several months ago And when the question came up from the press, what do you think of military aid, offensive aid to Ukraine? She said, it's eine schlechte Idee. And they said, what do you think, Herr Obama? And he said, well, we haven't decided yet. And Angela Merkel said, nochmals, eine schlechte Idee. And then she went off to Moscow 2 days later and worked out one of the ceasefires, which, to my great pleasure, seems to be holding right now after a very rocky several weeks. So if Mr. Putin and Angela Merkel and Hollande from France have made Poroshenko take notice and say, look, this has got to stop. And if the U.S. has said, okay, you can stop, then Poroshenko will stop. And there's much more hope for peace in Ukraine than ever before, meines Erachtens.
Let's speak about another open letter you recently signed, demanding Chancellor Merkel to take all steps necessary to put a stop to drone killings by the United States. An essential part of this drone warfare is being carried out through the Ramstein air base here in Germany. Does this play a role in your visit to Germany?
Well, we had planned this visit to Germany months ago, but one of the issues, of course, is Ramstein, because Americans don't know, by and large, and many Germans don't know, that without Ramstein, there can be no drone in war. It's an accident of geography and the accident that we have a base there. But this is sovereign German soil. And for the Bundesregierung to pretend that they don't know what's going on in Ramstein when they can read it in Der Spiegel, that shows that the German government is still after 70 years, still acting like a teenager vis-a-vis Washington. And, that's not good for the German people. And it's not good for the United States either, because we need somebody to hold us accountable, given the fact that our press doesn't let the general public know what's going on.
Ms. Murray, the Near East is, without any doubt, one of the world's hotspots. The media just reported that 50 intelligence officers complained that senior officials have watered down their reports on ISIS and on Al-Qaeda to make it appear as if they were weak and that the US is winning. What would be the purpose of those falsifications?
So I don't know for sure, but my best guess is that lack of war or peace is actually bad for business. It's bad for the war machine. It doesn't help the manufacturers of drones. It doesn't help those who profit from the sale of armaments. So I would say that also the analysts are very concerned because the truth is not getting out to the American people. So this is a very unfortunate development. It shows that our government is interested then in just promoting the status quo. And I think, again, that the bottom line is peace is bad for business.
Could this sort of falsifications contribute to blocking a diplomatic solution that would include, for example, Russia or the Assad government?
Unfortunately, yes, and I hope that indeed that doesn't happen. I think that right now the Iranians, the Russians, and the Americans need to get together around the table and see if they can solve some of these problems and contain the ISIS threat, which actually is threatening to spiral out of control. If the situation continues as it does, it will be very difficult to contain it. So we do need adults sitting around the table. And I think we have seen that with the recent United States deal with Iran, And with the rapprochement that is clearly present between Obama and Mr. Putin, that it's possible that these three countries could change the status quo and maybe end some of the proliferation of terrorism that's continuing in the Middle East. Also, it's clear that if things continue as they are, ISIS will only metastasize because when you continue to drone, when you continue to bomb, you are killing people and you're creating 50 or 100 more terrorists from the families of the survivors. So I'm glad the analysts spoke out, and I hope that other intelligence analysts within the US government take a hint and do the same thing.
Last May, a US court ordered the release of a secret report of the Defense Intelligence Agency dated August 12, 2012. Already 3 years ago, the DIA wrote, and I would like to quote, "There is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers of the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime." In other words, the US government knew about the terrorist threat this posed to the Syrian population. Was ISIS terrorism in US interest? How do you assess this?
I think that ISIS terrorism in Syria was indeed serving U.S. interests as long as it was trying to unseat the Assad government. And I think the U.S. deliberately looked the other way as ISIS proliferated in Syria, as long as this served U.S. purposes. Now, ISIS hasn't always served U.S. purposes, and I think the United States does go after ISIS in situations where it does not serve U.S. interests. But again, I think in Syria, the U.S. was happy to look the other way. And so it's obviously clear from this report that the United States policymakers had the information and could have nipped ISIS in the bud, if you will. But we're seeing the consequences of the failure to do that. And this is a good example of when good, honest intelligence is ignored when it's convenient. And I think we saw it back when the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan and the United States was content to allow Muslim fundamentalists to basically take over in the country, to push out the Soviet Union with U.S. help. And people wonder where Al-Qaeda came from. It came from the Mujahideen that were supported by the U.S. And now we see this Frankenstein that is called ISIS that is in almost every country in the Middle East. So as long as we continue to look the other way, we're going to reap unfortunate consequences. And I hope we can stop this by sitting around the table with rational actors in the region.
Mr. McGovern, on the issue of war and peace, there seems to be a growing number of differences developing between Berlin and Washington. In a commentary in the New York Times a few days ago, German Foreign Minister Steinmeier called for a diplomatic solution in Syria. How do you interpret this commentary?
I say that Steinmeier is very reasonable in thinking that this is the only possible solution. I take hope in the prospect that now that Iran is able to talk with us and we with them, and the Russians playing a constructive role, as President Obama has already acknowledged, that we can deal with this in a diplomatic way. It's not going to be easy, but I think that just as Herr Steinmeier has played a constructive role with respect to the Ukraine, I think he's playing a constructive role here. I think the German government knows that simply shouting, Assad has to go, Assad has to go, that's not a policy, that's a slogan. What you need to ask yourself is, what happens after Assad? And that picture is not very pretty. So hopefully people can come to their senses and say, all right, let's see how we can work this thing out. without droning half of Syria to death.